Hi all. Welcome to our last reading of 2020. I'm really happy. I know this is a COVID-sized crowd, but it's a really good crowd. So thank you all for making it out for our last reader, Phuc Tran. I know I say this a lot, and I can't say it enough. During these really weird times, especially story, I think is one of the most important things that we as humans do. So I'm just so happy not only to welcome Phuc here, but to welcome all of you to sit around our fire and listen to some really awesome story. That's not the real introduction. The real introduction is coming up to the stage right now. Ayla is going to introduce Phuc. So let's give Ayla a huge hand.
Hi. Okay. In his own words, Phuc Tran is a Scorpio. He rides a Triumph Thruxton, loves boxing movies, and has broken the same pinky twice in exactly the same spot, his own pinky, not someone else's. Tran was born in Saigon, Vietnam, and came to America at the age of 2 with his family as refugees in 1975. He grew up in a small apartment in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, with his parents and younger brother, Louis. Graduating from high school in 1991, he studied classical languages and literature at Bard College, where he also received the Cullinan Classics Prize, received his master's at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and then apprenticed to be a tattoo artist in New York City, all the while teaching Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. He and his wife settled down in Maine in 2003 and opened up their shop, Tsunami Tattoo. Most recently, he has taught Latin, Greek, and German at the Waynflete School in Portland, Maine, where he also currently lives. Tran has appeared on Maine Public Radio discussing grammar, classic literature, and Wright and Strunk's legacies. His 2012 TEDx talk titled Grammar, Identity, and the Dark Side of the Subjunctive was featured on NPR's TED Radio Hour. Most recently, in April 2020, Tran published his debut memoir, Saigon, which is, in his words, a memoir about growing up in a rural Pennsylvania town as a nerdy Asian punk rocker who would eventually become a Latin teaching tattooer. Saigon is a poignant, raw, and humorous memoir that gives an inside look into the lives of immigrants, the struggle between cultural identity and assimilation, and the universal teenage experience of trying desperately to fit in. The book was published through Fletcher Books and has won the 2020 New England Book Award in Nonfiction from the New England Independent Booksellers Association. As an aspiring nonfiction writer myself, I found Phuc Tran's memoir to be inspiring not just in his life story, but also in his honesty and openness about his life through his writing. I'm honored to be introducing him to you all tonight. And now, without further ado, I present Phuc Tran, author of Saigon, a memoir of great books, punk rock, and the fight to fit in.
Thanks so much, Ayla, and thanks Amy and Jeff and Lou and the English department. So yeah, who puts out a new book in a pandemic, right? This guy apparently, and this is the the book came out in April, and I've actually never seen it in a bookstore. Like ever. So it's kind of like a tree falling in the woods where I don't feel like it really happened. And this is the only live book event that I've ever done. Like everything else has been on Zoom, and everybody loves Zoom, right? You guys love it. I wish I Zoomed more, said no one ever. Thank you for coming out. It's Thursday at 7:30. I'm sure you have like 1,000 other things you'd rather be doing. So instead of sitting in a dimly lit auditorium and listening to a guy in a mask warble on. So I'll do some readings. I'd love to answer questions if you've got them. And just to make it a little bit less painful, I brought some awkward family photos, so I'll project those as well. And then also there's like some light porn in here, so if nothing else, you can just hang tight for the porn, because who doesn't love porn, right? So I'll just read a little bit. So if you haven't read the book, it's a coming-of-age memoir about growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania as the only Vietnamese refugee family. What could possibly go wrong? It was the 70s and the 80s, so we were just trying to assimilate super hard. As a young person, I discovered books, great books, specifically in the Western canon. And I rightly or wrongly thought that if I read as many of those books as possible, that would really speed me along in my process of assimilation and Americanization. I think the jury is still out on whether that was successful or not. So yeah, we'll see. So each chapter of the book is named after a great book that had a deep impact on me, and so that's why you see these headers here. So the prologue is named A Picture of Dorian Gray, and it's told, like, the themes are told through the lens of what I think were the important themes for me through Dorian Gray. And then the chapters go on, like there's a chapter called The Scarlet Letter and Madame Bovary and like the Iliad and so on and so forth. So the first thing I'll read is from the prologue, A Picture of Dorian Gray. Nestled in the Susquehanna Valley town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Carlisle Senior High School sprawled as a monolithic mid-century modern block of types, archetypes, and stereotypes. Industrial gray lockers ringed its hallways, the compartments narrow enough to repel most of your textbooks, but wide enough to collect the trash and detritus from your backpack. It was your own personal landfill. Linoleum floors, classrooms with chables, the combo chair tables of the 70s, blackboards, American flags, loudspeakers from which the wah, wah, wah of adult speak would drone. Our school district was so large that the juniors and seniors had their own separate high school, the so-called senior high school, and the freshmen and sophomores had their own underclassmen high school building. Carlisle High School stocked its seats and bleachers with a familiar cast from the 80s. The athletes who towered above the rest of us, the cheerleaders who lay supine beneath them, the geeks with their physics books under their arms, the preps with their tree-torns, swatches, and impeccable Benetton sweaters, a handful of black kids with MC Hammer pants and tall square afros tightly faded, punks and skaters with their leather jackets and black Converse, a few swirly hippies, the rednecks with their oily palms and cigarettes and trucks. Carlisle High School was another cultural cul-de-sac built with the craftsman blueprint of John Hughes, the Frank Lloyd Wright of teen malaise. Overwhelmingly white, Carlisle's population offered all the rainbows of Caucasia. The town's main employers were Dickinson College, the Army War College, a smoky stack of factories, and the service industries that had sprung up to support the aforementioned trifecta. In the spirit of public education, we, progeny, were all in the mix together. The itinerant army brats, the ivory sons and daughters of professors, doctors, and lawyers, the greasy offspring of waiters, cooks, and factory workers, and the token refugee family. The Tran family blended right into the mix like proverbial flies in the ointment. That is to say, we didn't. Carlisle's glare was unmistakably 80s, but its structure was straight from the post-war era, bricked together by the mortar of the 50s. We had a downtown Woolworths with a chrome luncheonette counter and red vinyl stools, and a grand movie theater with its incandescent marquee. The four corners of Carlisle's town square were righted by two courthouses, and two churches, Episcopalian and Presbyterian. God and law and law and God. It wasn't a subtle message to any of us living in Carlisle what was at the heart of the town. And the pièce de résistance, our high school was the town's designated Cold War fallout shelter. The blue and yellow radiation placards festooned our hallways, reminding us that we were only a button push away from nuclear annihilation. From what I gleaned on television, Carlisle seemed like a slice of American pie a la mode. We bottled lightning bugs on summer nights. Trucks flew Confederate flags. We loitered at 7-Elevens and truck stops. We shopped at flea markets and shot pellet guns. My high school provided a daycare for girls who had gotten pregnant but were still attending classes. We stirred up marching band pride and fomented football rivalries. The auto shop kids rattled by in muscle cars and smoked in ashen cobbles before the first period bell. We were rural royalty, Dairy Queens and Burger Kings. So that's my town of Carlisle. It's great. It's lovely. So I'm going to read a little bit from this chapter. This is filtered through Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols. So I read this in like my junior year of high school, I think, randomly. You know, it's like light reading for a 16-year-old, right? So Carl Jung wrote this work, this seminal work of psychoanalysis and dream analysis, and he was sort of the first person to put forth this idea of archetypes, archetypes that sort of live in your subconscious. You know, he put forth a lot of ideas. He has ideas about the collective unconscious. He wrote about UFOs and like cryptids, and he was a wild guy. And he deeply inspired Joseph Campbell, who then went on, took his work a little bit farther in his analysis of like the hero's journey and like, you know, mythology. And Joseph Campbell, who's a Carl Jung acolyte, wrote that book, Hero of a Thousand Faces, and so on and so forth. But anyway, but I didn't read Joseph Campbell, I read Carl Jung. And it was the first time that I realized as a kid that that my family might be symbolic in some way of something that we had no control over. And I had that sort of the dawning of that realization happened for me when I read Carl Jung. Let's see. This is not the porn part, by the way. Let's go. August 1983. Where are you people from? We were shopping at Giant, pushing our cart slowly. Lou and I took turns dangling from the cart, making impassioned pleas to our parents to buy Count Chocula. An older gentleman stepped into our path, intercepting us with his question, the question that as I grew up in Carlisle, I would sustain regularly, a query angled with varying degrees of inflection, from curious to neutral to cutting. Where are you people from? Even at 9 years old, I heard the nuances of you people. I caught his drift. His drift was sharp and edgy. It was pointed. His drift didn't sound like a friendly game of catch. My parents hadn't heard him because they were Vietnamesing with each other about their shopping list, and they weren't expecting anyone to speak to them. No one knew us in that informal way, and my parents weren't part of the small town colloquium that burbled and babbled around us. I saw other people, friends and neighbors, stopping to talk to one another. How's Little League? Donna doing okay? Did you see the game last night? We weren't in Little League. No one asked about my mother's health. We didn't watch sports on TV. The man spoke up louder with the kind of volume that inferred lack of Englishing. Where are you people from? I nudged my father, who broke off from his conversation with my mother to acknowledge the man. Yes, sir? Always publicly polite. Where are you people from? The man had yellow-tinted aviators and a graying mustache, reminding me of Magnum P.I. from TV. His belly overhung a large buckle, pressing taut against his plaid shirt. Maybe he was a private eye. Maybe he was working a case or was grocery store security. Oh, we're from Vietnam. My father smiled widely, nervously. His default was always to smile in awkward or strange situations, but I felt his posture tense up. My father also caught the man's drift, and he moved protectively in between the man and us. Yeah, thought so. Thought I recognized it. Vietnamese. I haven't heard it since I was in country. Thought to myself, sounds like Vietnamese. Lou, my brother, started to correct the man's pronunciation of Vietnamese, but I kicked him from behind the cart. Lou caught my drift as well, and he shut up. In the Marines there, stationed in Da Nang, 68 to 69. He looked at us all as he spoke, eyes slinking from my father's rigid smile to my mother to us kids. Oh, yes, Da Nang is in the middle of Vietnam. We're from Saigon. My father continued to smile as we stood still, nervous prey whiffing a predatory scent. My eyes scanned the American flag pin and other buttons on his jacket lapel. The gentleman looked at us, but his eyes were distant, their focus going far beyond where we were, right through us. I looked behind myself at the produce section, understanding that he wasn't looking at the broccoli or the cabbage. Beautiful country there, Nam. He said Nam with a southern lilt. Nam. Carlisle, surprising to most outsiders, has a slight southern drawl to its local dialect. Beautiful country, Nam. Goddamn shame what happened there. My father nodded. Goddamn shame, the man murmured. We all nodded and stood there for a time, staring at Mr. Magnum PI as he stared at the broccoli behind us. We, as a family in turn, looked blankly around. My parents gazed farther down the aisle. Lou and I fidgeted wordlessly at the cart, everyone bobbling their heads. The man hadn't asked us another question, so we had no answer to give. Well, you people have a good day. Thank you. You too, sir. My father and mother smiled and waved. Lou had used the distraction to sneak a box of Count Chocula into the cart. He nudged me. Why did that man ask us where we were from? My parents had already wandered farther down the aisle, sorting through the different cooking oils on the shelves. I was pushing the cart, so I answered Lou. Because that man fought in the Vietnam War. The metal grocery cart resumed its screechy circuit in between the aisles. So? Well, we're from Vietnam. I said Vietnam the way the man had said it. Not me. I was born here in Carlisle. Lou had a point. Well, that is true, but people are always going to ask you where you're from. But I'm from Pennsylvania, spoken like the future lawyer he would be. It's true you were born here, but it won't make sense to people. They'll still ask you where you're from. They mean mom and dad, and me, your family, where we're from. How did that man know that we weren't from here? It's complicated. I chose not to explain bigotry to Lou, though he probably already knew it. He had experienced being the only one in his classes too, but at least the other one at school was his brother. I was blindly hoping that he wasn't aware of the prejudice, but who was I kidding? Whose innocence was I trying to preserve? Why did he say that it was a shame what happened? Lou persisted. I don't know. He didn't really say, did he? I was pained to tell Lou to get used to being asked where he was from, but he had to. And eventually he would, whether I warned him or not, get used to it or get crushed by it. We all learned quickly to smile and nod whenever veterans would see us and tell us that they were in Nam. They named their branch of service, told us what years they were there, where they were stationed, and how they found the people and or the weather. Later, when I was older and a little savvier, I would round out my exchange by saying something like, "Thank you for your service," or "My grandparents worked for the U.S. Embassy," volunteering something to identify myself as one of the good ones. That was much later, when I realized that this wasn't about me or my family. It was about them and what we symbolized for them. How could I explain to Lou that we were symbols, that some people would never be able to see us as just people, that we were symbols of a painful and confusing war, symbols of the refugees they saw on TV, symbols of whatever they were afraid of, symbols of the people who had shot at them and killed their friends, brothers, and sons, symbols of whatever they wanted to see. That was what we were for Mr. Magnum PI in the middle of the giant grocery store, and we had to pause our shopping and be symbols for what he saw in the fuzzy, distant gaze of recollection and trauma. The Trans didn't choose to be symbolic or archetypal, but it wasn't our choice to make. Okay, now is the porn. I built it up too much. It's not actually porn. So this chapter is told through the lens of Madame Bovary. And for me, it was really, this phase in my life was really when I was like super into comic books, like just loved comic books and loved American pop culture, and I still do. But it was also that transition from loving comic books to discovering other things that young adolescent boys discover. I have a hard time explaining what the 7-Eleven was for kids of my age or people of my generation. It was kind of like a mini internet. Like the 7-Eleven had everything. Like it had video games. Actually, it was better than the internet. It had video games. It had like beef jerky. It had all the magazines you could possibly want. It had like windshield wiper fluid. You could get gas there. And you would like meet your friends there. It was very, I don't know, am I overselling the 7-Eleven experience, Lou? It was kind of like where you would go and meet your friends, and then if you had like 75 cents, you would buy like trading cards or candy. If you were really naughty, maybe you would shoplift. It was kind of an amazing place. Maybe it still is like that. I don't know. I haven't been to a 7-Eleven in a while. But anyway, so. All right. August 1984. 7-Eleven glittered with its large glass panes, and through the windows on the comic rack, I spotted a new issue of Uncanny X-Men. Lou, Twan, my older teenage second cousin, and I walked into the store with a collected $8 to spend and no adult to deny us and as untethered consumers. The American dream. At the comic rack, we spun the stand slowly, scrutinizing the month's new shipments of Marvel and DC titles. The Avengers, Hulk, Aquaman, The New Mutants, Green Lantern. I picked 2 comics, Spectacular Spider-Man and X-Men, after skimming the new issue of Firestorm, the Nuclear Man. In my reverie, Lou and Twan wandered away, but I eventually found Lou at the Donkey Kong machine. Where's Twan? He shrugged. Don't know, don't mess me up. I'm on the fireballs level. I left my brother furiously button-mashing, fireball leaping, and princess saving as I walked past the wall freezers that hummed with Coke, cans, and Hungry Man dinners. Twan stood in the back of the 7-Eleven at the wall of magazines. Rolling Stone, Guns and Ammo, Newsweek, Car and Driver, and Time looming over him. A wall of America. Hey, there aren't comics over here, I told him. Well, except heavy metal, I guess, but those comics are weird. I know. I wasn't looking for comics. I wanted to look at these. He held a swimsuit catalog. Really? Yeah. Look at all these women. This is a good one. Look at this lady. He flashed me the layout of a blonde woman in a standard red one-piece bathing suit. There was nothing overtly erotic about her other than the fact that she was wearing a bathing suit in the middle of a Carlisle 7-Eleven, smiling warmly. You can almost see her nipple. I grunted in agreement, even though I did not espy the supposed singular nipple, but I wasn't going to argue with him. I was nervous that he was so brazenly ogling these ladies, but he didn't seem to care. Emboldened, I look over his arm, holding my Spider-Man and X-Men to my side, my childish trophies dimming in the glow of Twan's beauties. The women were all gorgeous, of course, blondes, brunettes, redheads, all shades of hair in between, purportedly modeling swimwear, but in fact, titillating teenage boys who had no interest in the latest season of ladies' beachwear. I stood next to Twan, feeling flush and moving my comics in front of my shorts, in case an ill-timed and unmanageable erection decided to pitch tent. My comics were a cover from my libido, maybe the most important thing Spider-Man could do for me right there. That was a superhero's work. I could have walked away, but the siren song of these maidens was stronger than the embarrassment of my 6th grade boner. Twan paged through the catalog slowly, on the hunt for a nipple, singular or plural. Being only a swimsuit catalog, it yielded little else, but Twan was undeterred, poring over the pages, a beachcomber, desperate for peekaboo pennies. 5 yards away from us, the payload of real pornography splayed behind the cashier's counter in paper bags, or plastic bags. Behind a formidable fortress of moral and legal censures, the sign prominently said, 18 plus only, and a less than formidable mustachioed clerk with a ratty mullet. From where we stood, we only peeked at the titles and the tops of the cover girls as if they were sawn in half, a lascivious magic show, the black plastic magazine panel shielding our friable innocence from full frontal nudity. Lou, my brother, was so good at Donkey Kong and had at least 3/4 that he kept playing while Twan and I looked through a second swimsuit catalog. We then picked up a copy of Iron Horse, a biker magazine that brazenly bared women's breasts in grainy black and white amateur photos that readers had sent in of their wives and girlfriends. Twan mumbled gross as he put back the Iron Horse quickly, repelled by these sagging biker tits, which, astride flaming choppers, were covered in blue tattoos. "Hey," the clerk called to us, "this ain't a library." His declaration lacked conviction, the tired reading of a bad script. "Ain't a library. Y'all gotta either buy something or get out." "Okay." Twan pried Lou from the Donkey Kong, while I laid my 2 comics on the counter and transacted the purchase. 7-Eleven mullet guy slid my comics into a paper bag as I not so subtly leered at the booty behind the counter. Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler, Swank, Jugs. Why the extra G? Penthouse Forum. I had no idea what differentiated one magazine from the other, noting that their common denominator was the insurmountable barrier between me and their boobs. The faint aroma of adolescent arousal evaporated in the harsh daylight outside the 7-Eleven, and on the way home, I refocused on my comics, walking with Spider-Man open in front of me, while Twan flipped through the X-Men. Lou, my brother, squeezed in between us, reading both comics simultaneously over our elbows. At our apartment, Twan and I sat on the front step with the new comics while Lou hopped on his bike and rode a circuit around looking for the neighborhood kids. We read our comics, stopping to show each other an ad for X-ray glasses or Gremlins, the movie. We debated Wolverine's ability to slice through anything with adamantium claws versus Spider-Man's agility. They were our superheroes. Interwoven with their powers, deeply written into our narratives, they were their tales of outsiders, freaks, exiles, aliens. Were there ever 2 boys for whom comic books were more enchanting? If not us, for whom was intended the make-believe of so much power intertwined with the pain of being so outcast? I couldn't imagine. Twan said something that broke the spell of superheroes. "You know, I have a couple of Playboy and Penthouse magazines." He spoke without looking up from the comics. "Really?" I let the X-Men fall into my lap. "From where?" "My older brother. Maybe I'll show you the next time you're at our apartment." "Seriously?" "You can't have them, but you could definitely look at them." And so it began. We didn't know it at the time, but in our own way, we were enacting the predictable teenage rite of bequeathing porn. When he did eventually show me a Playboy and a Penthouse, we huddled in his room with the door closed. He explained to me all the subtleties of the pornos as we leafed slowly past glossy pages of aquanet and turquoise eyeshadow, breasts and legs pulled in revelatory directions, tasteful props of neoclassical columns to elevate what was otherwise low and guttural. Twan was a fount of information as well as opinions disseminated as information. He was happy to pontificate, and I was eager to take notes. Why was Penthouse better? Why was Hustler kind of gross? What exactly was Penthouse Forum? What was Swank? Twan knew, or at least had an opinion, on all of it, even though he only had copies of Playboy and Penthouse. I marveled at how he had access to such verboten knowledge, but the porn pile under his bed did not lie. And even though he couldn't tell me why Jugs magazine required the extra G, he was my first guide at the edge of a forbidden primal wood. I lingered at its threshold, clinging to my comic books and Saturday morning cartoons, but feeling the visceral pull and tug of something fleshier and irresistible. All right. I'll read one last little bit. This is a short bit. This is just the intro to Metamorphosis. Or Metamorphosis, sorry. So in Latin, the accent is on the O in Metamorphosis. but in English it's metamorphosis, and my audiobook editor and I had like a long argument about this, and then she had to look it up in Merriam-Webster's, and I was wrong. So metamorphosis. I think there's a picture. Yes, there is. Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis is a simple story. Gregor Samsa awakes to find himself transformed into a giant bug. When he discovers that he's a giant bug, he immediately looks at the clock and thinks about which train he can still catch to get to work on time. By himself, he's not freaking out about being a giant roach at all. His parents and sister, whom he's been supporting, freak out. His supervisor from work shows up and freaks out. Gregor has turned into a bug, but he does not freak out about his transformation until he has to navigate his relationships with his family and his work supervisor. You read The Metamorphosis and you realize it's his family's ugliness towards Gregor that moves the story. Gregor is now a giant roach, and he cannot do anything about it. His family, instead of acting with compassion and kindness, sends Gregor to his room and locks the door. What's worse than turning into a giant bug? Turning into a giant bug and having your family act like a bunch of assholes. And isn't that adolescence? A biological change over which we have no control. And then our family, like a bunch of assholes, treats us like an insect in the midst of a metamorphosis that we ourselves hardly understand. Suddenly, with a different focus from the perspective of a bug, we see who they are. So I'll pause there. Should I leave that picture up of awkward teenage me? So yeah, this is like my long hair phase. Like I would like grow my hair out, and then I would like shave part of it, and then it would grow it out, and then shave part of it. I don't know why I did that. Those are all the long hair parts. So I'd be happy to answer questions, or maybe I can convince Lou and Amy to get up and do improv with me. Or you can just all go home and watch some Hulu. Yes. Thanks. Yes. You say, have I changed from my day job? Oh, yeah, sure. So, like, part of that is, like, how did I end up being a tattooer and writing a book? Yeah, well, you just have to give a TED Talk that goes national, kids. That's all you do, right? It's super easy. No, so in 2012, I gave a TEDx talk here in Maine at Bates, and then that talk picked up some national attention. It was on NPR's TED Radio Hour, and then 4 years after that, I think. So after that, I gave that talk, I started doing the live storytelling circuit in Portland, and so that's when I really started like crafting stories and crafting scripts, as it were, to tell on stage. And I was saying before in Pat's class that was really like, when you have 7 minutes to tell a story and keep an audience's interest, and like really it's like you got to get on it and get off it, like that's really what like was like, okay, like this story's got to be more cake and less frosting. Like I don't have time, 7 minutes is not a lot of time to like yammer on. So I did that for a couple of years, and then in 2016 a literary agent saw the TEDx talk and then reached out to me and said, you seem like you have an interesting story and an insane way to tell it. Do you want to write a book? And I was like, sure. No adventure starts with no. So I try to say yes to as much as I can, as long as it won't kill me. And maybe even if it might kill me, I might say yes anyway. So yeah, Is that a satisfactory answer? Yes. Yeah. Yep. Sure. I mean, I think like it's like the way my brain is wired. Like I really love, I love sort of like playing around with language and like, bending it and making words up, like like that's sort of like the great fun of it. And like, I actually really love, like just, I mean, English is in and of itself, like for all of its sort of like horrendous spelling, like it's got such a rich vocabulary. It's got one of the largest sort of working vocabularies, like larger than like modern European languages. Cause like English, like linguistically, it's like your hoarder grandma. Like it won't throw things away. It's like, ooh, this word, I'll keep it, put it in the Oxford English Dictionary. Oh, this word too, also keep that one. And so like English just keeps like sort of accruing words that it won't throw away. So, cause it sort of has like a huge operative vocabulary, which I love. And then also it has like lots of other sort of like funny things about it. I think like the TED Talk is like tricky because I'm really, I'm staking out a little bit of a ground, as an amateur linguist. There's like, I could get like super, super nerdy here. I'll get like kind of nerdy, but not too nerdy. So there's like two schools of thought in linguistics. So there's the language universalists who are basically like, it doesn't matter what language you speak, you can think any thought you want, and all languages are pretty much the same. So those are the universalists, right? So universal sort of adaptability. And then there are other people, I guess I'm sort of like lightly in that camp, but not so hardcore. They're called the language determinists. And they basically are like, language does have an effect on how you see the world. It does have an effect on how you express yourself, and it has an effect on both your input and your output, right? The challenge, I think, and so those folks are like, no, like if you speak this language, you may end up seeing the world. If you speak like, let's say, there's another TED Talk, a famous one, about the difference between Chinese and German, and this TED Talk was talking about how there could be a correlation between fiscal savings and responsibility and tenses in German and tenses in Chinese. That like German has a more robust tense verbal system than Chinese does, and Germans are good at saving money. I'm really like being very reductive here, but basically it's like Germans have this, Chinese don't. Germans are good at saving money, Chinese not so much, I think language universalists bristle at this because what they're worried about is that the dark side to this is that you could be quantifiably saying language X is better than language Y because language X does this, language Y does this. And if you do that, right, then you're creating a hierarchy. And as we know, like if you're saying this is better than this, then we start, looking down on this. And we're like, well, people who speak Spanish are terrible and people who speak German are great because German is a quantifiably better language than Spanish, right? And so that's what I think, in a nutshell, what the universalists are worried about. I don't think that it necessarily has to go down that dark path. Like I think that you can just observe difference as difference, and it doesn't necessarily need to be X is better than Y. It's just like, oh, isn't this just a funny observation that this language encourages people who speak it to think in this way? It's not better or worse. It's just observationally different, right? It's not like we're saying like, cats are better than dogs. They're just different, right? I mean, sorry, cat and dog people. I love them both for different reasons. The other, I think, compelling thing for me from the language universalist side is that their argument is you can't measure it. Like it's not quantifiable. Like there's no way to measure how much French or German affects the speaker. Like it's not like it's not like cholesterol. You know, and the determinist in me, you know, I'll say this, like most people who are in the language universalist side are all monoglots. They're not polyglots. They didn't grow up bilingual. So that is just an interesting observation that I'll make. Like a lot of the research I'm seeing is like, well, because you talk to people who are polyglots and they'll be like, yeah, it's like, this is funny. This is a funny joke in French. It's not funny in English. And here's why, you know, it's like, you know, French is just hilarious, right? You know, I'll say this, like you can't measure it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not true. Like I'll say that, you know, absence of proof is not proof of absence, right? So just because you can't measure something in a language, like maybe it just means we haven't figured out a way, like a metric to measure it yet. So I think for me the possibility is open that there is some language determinism that is true. We just don't have a way to measure it. So I'll stop there because that was like super nerdy. And this is where like you would like stop the YouTube video and be like, I'm just gonna watch this video of like cats now. Yes. No, it's okay. I do, you know, in my tattoo training, I came up in what's called a street shop. So it was sort of like do whatever comes in the door. So I did that for like 7 years in New York City, and that literally like anything could possibly come through the door. So I feel like I left New York pretty well rounded, but I think I gravitate towards traditional, like I would say like half the tattoos I do are like traditional Japanese style. I would say like 30% are like maybe like Art Nouveau, like floral, and then like the other 20%, if I did the math right, is like, you know, kind of like whatever the client wants. But I would like to imagine that I'm relatively good at a lot of those styles. I mean, there's definitely things that I'm not good at doing, or you know, other people could do better. But yeah, is that a nod? I gave you right, 50%, 30%, 20%. All right, yeah, sure. Thanks. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So chapter 1, the prologue is the picture of Dorian Gray. And I think so these were all books that I read like in my late teens and then early 20s. And, you know, I'll say this, like, I think they were the books that like I read them and like a light bulb went on for me about something that had happened in my past, or patterns that I was seeing in my life, or like feelings that I was feeling that I didn't have a container for. And so like these books were like, oh, is that what it is? So like the first time I read Dorian Gray, and like there's this like weird sort of intense like love-hate, mostly hate relationship between Dorian Gray and his painting. And I was like, oh, like what is this like metaphor? Like, and it probably isn't even that like Oscar Wilde intended, you know, for like some suburban 80s Vietnamese kid to like read this work and be like, this is what he's gonna think about. But it's just how it landed on me. You know, and I'll say this too, like, you know, when I was a teenager, like my superpower, as it were, was like anytime I would read a book, I'd be like, what the fuck does this book have to do about my life? You know, like, and I'm, you know, it's so incredibly self-absorbed and, you know, narrow-minded, but I think that's like the nature of being a teenager, right? Like a teacher puts something in front of you and you're like, this is stupid because it has nothing to do with me. And I definitely felt that way. And I think I always saw that as a challenge. And I would be like, okay, I'm going to read, you know, the Scarlet Letter, and I'm going to figure out, you know, what this book has to do with my life. And sometimes, like, I would definitely bend, you know, or squeeze anything that I could possibly get out of a book, because I felt like otherwise it would just be a complete waste of my time. So the first book was A Picture of Dorian Gray, and it was really just about this like weird relationship, internal all, that I had with this other Vietnamese kid that showed up at my school, you know, when I was a junior, and this kid just showed up, and I had felt this like weird revulsion for him, And so I think for me, it was like thinking about why I felt that way about that kid. The next chapter is The Plague by Albert Camus. And for me, that book really sort of framed for me that tension that we always feel between knowing something and believing in something. So the tension between faith and knowledge, watching it play out between my parents and their lives. And my parents are devout Catholics. And even sort of what we think about, even in terms of like the national conversation about America, right? Like, what do we know America to be, and what do we have faith that America could be, and how those two things, like there's an interplay between those two things, and sometimes they amplify each other, and then sometimes they totally cancel each other out. Crime and Punishment for me, when I read that, again, right, like definitely not Dostoevsky's intention, but like I read that book and I was really struck, pun intended, by the violence in that book. And that was the first time that I read that, and I was like, oh, there's a lot of violence in my home life, and sort of thinking about, yeah. So it was the first, I think it was like the first book, like great book that I read, where like a murder was like the primary, like a super brutal murder, like an axe murder, like literally. If you haven't read it, spoiler alert, it happens early, so not ruining anything for anybody. Like it's just like about like this like brutal axe murder. Is that like, are there any other like great works of Western literature that start off like that? I don't think so, right? It's so brutal. I just remember being really like thinking like, oh, this is all about like violence, and it was the first time that I thought about that in a like what that was like in my own home life. The Scarlet Letter, like Hester Prynne is like my hero, like from high school. She's like amazing. It's just being about like an outsider hating your town, but then also like not being able to leave your town. The Christmas Carol for me was really about like thinking about like time, like your past, your present, and your future, and how those really interplay. Like for me, like when I read that, I was like, this doesn't really seem like it's a holiday story. Like it's not about Santa. It's like about ghosts and like time travel. Like you know, this is super weird. Man and His Symbols, about symbolism. Madame Bovary, I read that and I was really struck by, it's very early on in the book, and Flaubert talks about how Emma Bovary, like her whole life is totally like screwed up because she was reading like trashy art. And that really made me think about like what is our relationship to art? Does it matter? Like, is art important, and art, can art or trashy art really like screw up how we see the world? Because Flaubert seems to really lay that out there. It's not that subtle. He's just like, yeah, she's like totally bonkers because she would just read like romance novels and then think that her life was supposed to be like that. Pygmalion, which was a play by George Bernard Shaw, was really the first time that I learned about code switching before it was called code switching. And like when I read that, I was like, oh, is that what I was doing? Is that what like my parents did? I don't know. Like it's basically like if you change the way you talk and you change the way you dress, can you fit in with people? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Metamorphosis, right? Being a teenager, having your family be assholes, right? That's totally what that's about, right? The Importance of Being Earnest is a play by Oscar Wilde. And that was, what I got out of that was it was really like about like pretending that you're really somebody that you're not, but then at the end, you really are the person that you were pretending to be, right? So it's like the flip side of like fake it till you make it, where it's like, there's like this blurry line between what is authentic and what is artificial, right? And maybe even that distinction is like a false one. There's only two more. Autobiography of Malcolm X for me was like amazing. That was like the first time that in high school that I read that. And like I thought about like racism in like a big way. And this was like it was the 80s. Like we were very, very, in terms of racial thinking, like very primitive. Like it's weird to think about, but like when I was growing up, it was like the most unracist thing you could say was like, I don't see race. I'm totally colorblind. Like everybody looks the same to me. And like that was like cool. That was like sweet. Like if you could just get to that point, like you were totally not racist. And we all know now how like racist that is, but it was the 80s. Like, so anyway, so Malcolm X was the first time that I was like, wait a second, like how do Asian people or Vietnamese people fit into this binary of like black-white racism, right? And then the Iliad, and again, I'm sure not Homer's intent, but like when I read the Iliad, it was really like when I read that, I was like, oh, this seems like it's about power and being the best, and how those two things are not always, they don't always line up. That sometimes the people who are in charge and in power are actually the worst at their job, and that like you can be the best at something, but if the group or the community decides that you're not the best at something, like you're kind of shit out of luck. So, sorry, that was super long, but sure. I could have emailed that to you too. Yeah. Yes. Oh. Oh, which town? Oh, great. Which town did your family grow up in? Oh, okay. Yeah, sure, sure. Ooh, for me personally, none. Yeah, there's no overlap, and I think that's okay. Like I think I actually try to resist the need to have those two things connect. Like I think there's just like a lot of, I think like we're under pressure for everything to make sense all the time, and I actually I think they're like they're not coplanar at all. Like those two facets of my personality, like being a tattooer and like being a Latin teacher, like they intersect. They're like, and they just don't. That's okay. Like like I'm a multifaceted person, as I'm sure you are and everybody else is, and that's okay that they don't meet. Like I think about like Vladimir Nabokov, like he was an incredible writer, and he was like a worldwide lepidopterist, right? Like he discovered like new species of butterflies. Like I don't know if those two things, like being a writer and being a bug dude, necessarily need to go together. Or like Steve Martin, he's like an amazing stand-up comedian and an actor and a writer and like a master banjo player. I mean, like, I think it's okay. Like, actually, it's one of the things that I love, like with tattooing, is like when I meet people and like I'm tattooing them, and then they'll tell me something about like a personal interest or even a career thing that like seems so out of left field or unpredictable. Like I love that unpredictability of who we are. It's it's sort of it's we're multitudes, right? We're complicated people. So sorry, none of they don't go together. Yeah. No, it is. Yeah. 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 No, I mean, there was just there was no possible way that college was going to live up to what I thought it was going to be. Like I think like in my 17-year-old brain, I was like, everything that's bad, it's Carlisle's fault. Like Carlisle is racist, only Carlisle's racist. If I go to like college, it won't be racist there, or, like it's like people are narrow-minded and they don't love books like I love books, or, whatever. So I think like I had built up in my mind that college was just going to be the exact opposite experience of whatever my high school experience was. And, and so like, how could that possibly live up to like all of the expectations that I'd sort of foisted upon it? Like how could college possibly live up to it? So it was a big disappointment for me, really. Like I, got there, like I remember like I was just like, my roommate would, sleep in, skip classes, like, get wasted on like a Wednesday night and be like, what are you doing? You're in college. You're supposed to be reading books, you know? And he'd be like, no way, dude. You know, it was like 18-year-old kids who'd like never lived away like from their family, and like no judgment. Like that's, you know, in hindsight, I'm like, oh, they were being normal college kids. I was the fucking weirdo who was like, no, guys, I want to read extra books, you know, or whatever. Because, you know, that's me. But I was like, no, like, we're paying so much money. Like, don't you want to learn? You know, like, and it's both, right? It's, like, for me, it felt like either or, because I was 17 and dumb. And it's not either or. It's like, you should do both things, like, get wasted on a Wednesday night and also read lots of books. So that was part of the disappointment. And then I think also, like, just not vibing with the kids in the departments, you know, like I almost dropped out, but then I just ended up switching majors and finding like sort of like-minded people who wanted to study dead languages. So yeah, that's not book worthy really. That's more like, you know, that's like a sad like emo song or something, and then I can write that. All right, Lou. Yes. Yeah, you know, so shout out to mental health and, you know, self-care being healthcare. You know, I did like a ton of counseling and therapy in my mid-30s. So like that was like the heavy, for me, like that was the heavy lifting, was like doing all the emotional work to process like all the shit that happened to me as a kid, and like being in a place where I was okay with that. And I went into counseling because I found out I was going to have a kid, and like it wasn't because I was like, oh, I think I'm going to write a book, and I don't want it to be like this, like, you know, like trauma porn, you know, like you know, like that happened like 10 years later. But you know, my wife and I found out that we were going to have a kid, and I remember thinking like, oh, like I'm going to be a father, you know, who am I as a son? And like I really got stuck on that idea of like being a son. It didn't feel good to me. I was like, oh, like I'm going to be a, you know, like I'm a son, like what does it mean to be a father? And they're flip sides of the same coin. And I felt like whatever work I had to do to sort of clear that, you know, or like give myself a blank slate or be in a healthy space, like I owed it to my kid at the time, like my unknown mystery kid. I was like, if I'm going to bring her into the world, like I got shit to work through. So like that was in my mid 30s, and I was like, so like I went into counseling, like worked stuff out, and then yeah, just kind of lived my life. And so I think like when the time came for me to write the book, like again, like the emotional part was like that work was already done. So I think like any revelations I had, like any epiphanies I had or processing, like I'd already had like 10 years earlier. And I don't think I could have written the same book if I hadn't done that work ahead of time. Yeah. Is that satisfactory? Yeah. So also everyone, mental health, right? Take care of yourselves. Yeah, very important. So yeah. And it's not, I think I think this next generation, it's much less stigmatized, I hope. I hope it is. Like I think it like I hope that like my generation is like that last generation where it was like kind of, you know, taboo to talk about, you know, like, you know, and like, I hope that, you know, in like my kids' generation, like you talk about going to your counselor, like you talk about going to your dentist, you know, but I mean, I think, yeah, I hope, anyway, yeah. I thought this event was 60 minutes, right? I don't want to keep you guys. You got like papers to write and things to do. No questions? Awesome. Thanks. Well, thank you so much. This is the only live event I ever did for this book, so thank you so much for coming. And yeah, good luck with your semester.
All right, friends, thank you so much for coming and listening to Phuc Tran. What a wonderful way to close out the first half of our season. Stick around. In February, we have Carrie Arsenault, writer of Milltown, first up. And we don't know yet if she'll be live or online, so I appreciate your flexibility. And rock it out. Have a great Thanksgiving for those of you I'm not going to see. And have a great night.